Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a book I just finished listening to called Memoirs of a Kamikaze, written by Kazuo Odachi. It came out just a couple years ago. I listened to it on Hoopla, which if you are watching this video here in the United States, you should know about that. It's basically a service that public libraries use, and if you have a library card, wherever you live, you can create an account and log in, and you can borrow audiobooks and TV shows and all sorts of different stuff for free using Hoopla. So imagine it's kind of like Audible, only like in a library sense. So it's a really great thing to know about if you're someone who has, looking for something to listen to on your commutes or when you're working out or whatever that might be. So I recently borrowed this title from Hoopla and really enjoyed listening to it. I want to share a few thoughts about the book with you now. So the book is, as the title suggests, memoirs of a man who served in the Japanese military during World War II and was part of the division or group that was responsible for kamikaze attacks. It's a really fascinating story, and I learned a lot from it. A couple things to say about the book. First off, it's very much a personal story. The gentleman who is telling the story, Odachi is his last name, lived beyond World War II, so spoiler alert, he doesn't die in a kamikaze attack, although he came very close, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But he served in World War II as a Navy pilot, was eventually at the end of the war involved with the Kamikaze Corps, and then after the war went on to have a very long career working in Tokyo with the Metropolitan Police. So the book tells the story of his life both during and after the war. And then he, in his retirement, has taught for many years as a kendo instructor, which is a Japanese martial art. And as far as I know, he is still alive today. He's in his 90s, Odachi is. This book was published in 2020, I think, so it's just a couple of years old. But at the time of the writing of this book, he was still alive. And basically, he had served in World War II, he had served with the kamikazes, but had really not talked about his experience for about 70 years. And it was only later in his life, when he was a kendo instructor, and that he got to know a number of men who learned about his story and said, you need to record this, you need to put this down for posterity. So if you get a copy of the book, you'll see it's written by Kazuo Odachi, and then it has two other gentlemen who were friends of his who were training with him in kendo, heard about his experience and said, we want to help you write this book. So they basically sat him down and interviewed him, and then they pulled those interviews together into this book. And it's written as a kind of first-person narrative story told from his perspective. The book really kind of has two parts. The first part is talking about Odachi's upbringing and his service in World War II as a pilot. And then the second part of the book is talking about his life after the war as a policeman and a kendo instructor. And it's a really fascinating window into this interesting part of the history of World War II in the Pacific. The book starts, as I said, with Odachi's upbringing, which was very much in the shadow of World War II. He was, I think, only 17 when he signed up and joined the war effort as a pilot. He might have been 16. So he was very young. Pretty much everything he could remember was the militaristic Japan, where they were being trained in kendo as a young boy, trained for war, and when war broke out, it was something everyone was expecting. And he had seen others go off to war before him, and he actually was descended from a fairly well-known samurai family. So he had that kind of martial background in his family tree. He grew up in a very militaristic time in Japanese history and was very eager to be able to serve when he was old enough to do so. He went to training, got into the Navy, became a pilot, flew the famous Zeros, and fought in the Philippines and was stationed in Taiwan, and had a really interesting kind of military career in that regards. But it was only at the end of his time and the end of World War II that the kamikaze operation got underway. So most of us are somewhat familiar with the kamikazes. We know that the Japanese had kamikaze pilots who would basically suicide bomb, fly into carriers and things to try to destroy them. And it was a tactic that Japan put in place really at the end of the war. It was kind of the last, I think, 9 or 10 months of the war, and it was kind of a last-ditch effort to stop the American advance. And at one point was really motivated by a desire to kind of, defend Japan. Later on in the war, they kind of knew, they could see the writing on the wall, the Japanese leaders could, but they thought if we can do as much damage as possible, that puts us in a better position to negotiate when peace rolls around. And Odachi was one of the pilots who was serving as a kamikaze. Now, one of the first questions I had, and probably a question you have if you're listening to this, is if he was a kamikaze pilot, how is he still alive, right? Isn't the whole point of a kamikaze pilot that they would, commit suicide to do damage to the enemy? And it's really interesting to see how Odachi describes what it meant to be a kamikaze. First off, he really has a burden in the book to try and defend the honor of the men who served as kamikaze pilots. He says, there's kind of this caricature that they were just, crazy, maniacal, radical, suicide driven men. And he says that's not really the case, as he tells the story. And there's some dispute about this in the scholarship and historiography of who's exactly is responsible for the kamikaze idea. And the way that Odachi presents it is that it was presented as a volunteer thing, but it was kind of a heavy-handed volunteer thing. So they called all of these pilots together and said, here is how we want you to serve. And they basically said, we can't force you, but who was willing to volunteer? And they wouldn't let people leave until they had kind of begun to volunteer. And of course, once you get a few young men volunteering, others follow. You got to remember, all of these guys are 17, 18, 19, very young men, very impressionable, and they saw themselves as having already given their life for their country by signing up. And so they said, well, this is just the natural next step. So Odachi is very burdened to say, don't fault the pilots for this, and don't paint them as these kind of crazy radicals. They were just doing really what seemed to be the only option, and they wanted to give their lives for their country in a way that counted. And so that's very much what he's trying to do to defend the honor of his comrades that died. He is not afraid to give criticism to the Japanese leadership and sees this as a real dark thing, that they would do this and other atrocities as well. But he says, don't fault the pilots for it. So you can certainly understand where he's coming from on that. And he goes on to talk about what that meant to volunteer to be a kamikaze. It didn't mean that you would just hop into your plane and go find something to crash into. To be a kamikaze means that you were eligible for kamikaze missions. So at any point you could get the orders to say, you're going tomorrow to serve as a kamikaze. So there were men who would volunteer to be kamikazes, but you might not be signed up for a mission right away. If you were signed up for a mission, even then, you might be assigned to fly escort, because especially as the kamikaze tactic became more well known, American fighters were looking for Japanese Zeros and realized that they might be trying to fly into carriers and things, and so they were a target, right? American fighters would go to knock out those Zeros so that they couldn't crash their planes. So there would be some pilots on the Japanese side whose job it was to be kamikazes and find something to fly into, and other Japanese pilots whose job it was to protect those planes. So Odachi flew on a number of missions like that, where he was going as the escort for his friends who were going to die, which is, you can just imagine what that would be like, to fly off with your buddies knowing that if all goes well, you'll come back and they won't. I mean, that's just a chilling thing, but that's what he experienced. There were other times too where you might be assigned to be a kamikaze, but you would go and either there wasn't anything there. So he talks about how the Japanese radar was nowhere near as good as the American radar. And he says, in some ways, that probably saved my life, because there were times where we thought there was, ships coming in or something, and we'd be sent out to go on a kamikaze mission, and nothing was there, right? So there were times where that would happen. Also, especially at the beginning, they were very judicious. They really wanted to take out like carriers, because if you had a Zero crash into a carrier in just the right way or the wrong way, depending on how you're looking at it, you could take out the whole thing. That would wipe out all 80 planes on that ship. all of the sailors that were on that ship. There could be thousands of men. So that was, again, something that these pilots thought, if I'm going to go down, I want it to be worthwhile, and that's what they would go for. But they didn't want to just crash into a transport ship or something. Actually, he talks about how later in the war, they were kind of told by their superiors, just go out and crash into these transports, and they thought, that's not what we signed up for. That's not worth it, kind of thing. So for all those reasons, you can see how Odachi and others were able to serve as kamikazes without being able to fulfill their mission, just depending on the circumstance. But he actually had a very close call. He was present when the first successful kamikaze flights took off. They took off from Here's Air Base, so he got to see those guys go and not come back. And then he was actually on the runway with a squadron that was going to be kamikazes, and he was going to find something to crash into, and he was all psyched up for it when they were beginning to take off down the runway, and this mechanic's car comes pulling out in front of them, and the guy's like waving his arm and telling them to stop, and he says, there's an announcement on the radio, mission's called off, you need to come listen. They go back inside, and it's the Japanese emperor saying that unconditional surrender had just been accepted, so the war was over. So he was that close. I mean, he said if that mechanic had been a minute later, I would be dead. So that was his war experience. And he goes on to talk about more of the details of that and some of the men that he knew and things. But you can just imagine, he's experienced all of this by the time he's 19, I think. And then he goes home and he has to figure out what's next. So it was very interesting for me as an American to hear kind of inside the Japanese perspective, and especially how the kamikaze stuff operated. But it was equally interesting to hear what was it like in Japan after the war, after the bomb, right? Because we're used to kind of ending the story at that point. And for him, it was very much a new beginning. And he actually transitioned pretty well. Early on, he was looking for a way to kind of serve, and he had a real burden that he had survived, and he needed to make it worthwhile. So at first, when he came back to his village, he was just trying to kind of boost morale and be involved in different things. But he found out that there was a big need for police officers in Tokyo. There had been a lot of just decay and lawlessness and transience and turmoil, and so they needed police officers. And so he went and served there. And he tells a lot of stories about what that was like, different things that they had to face. There was a lot of gang activity. There was a lot of extreme leftists who were kind of agitating for rebellion. And so the police officers were often kind of caught between these different things. And so he talks about his time, and he served as a police officer, kind of on the ground. He served as a detective. He served in the motorcycle corps, and just really interesting career. Again, served for more than 30 years. And during that time, again, when he was a child, he'd begun studying kendo in school. It was very common at that time, and perhaps it is still today. I don't know. I've never been to Japan, but which is a Japanese martial art called the Way of the Sword, right? And you practice with these bamboo swords. It's based on ancient samurai practices, but he was really drawn to that as a young man. He continued to practice it as a police officer, and actually got into a group that was more focused on that in the police corps. And then when he retired, he really made that his life. And every day he would go to the local school, and he would teach children kendo. And he would also train at the police kendo dojo as well. And that's where he met the gentleman who would eventually find out that he had served as a kamikaze, and they encouraged him to write this book. So it's a really fascinating read. And one of the things that stood out to me was just to see, again, for all of the brokenness and folly of the Japanese leadership, to see how human these people are, right? And how human their experiences were, and the kind of stories they told, the kind of struggles that they had, the difficulties that he faced both in the war and after the war, kind of grappling with that, and grappling with the generation that just wanted to move on past what for him he couldn't move on past. Is something that you hear those same stories from American vets, or from British vets or German vets, just people who have served in war have these experiences. And it's always sobering to kind of step into the shoes of the enemy of this opposing nation, and just to hear what was that like, right? And what was actually motivating the men on the ground, and seeing once again that for all of the politics and the rhetoric that was motivating the countries as a whole, the guys on the ground, the guys actually fighting in the trenches or in the skies in this case, were often motivated by a more simple love for home, love for their families, and love for the brothers at their side. And so it's always interesting just to see see those dynamics played out. And the book is written really well. Odachi is a good writer and has good turns of phrase. He explains things very kind of dispassionately. He doesn't kind of get into a lot of defense of himself or attacking himself. It's just kind of, here was my experiences. So in that sense, it's a very good memoir. It is very personal, and I think that's one of its strengths. The weakness of that might be if you're looking for something that's going to tell you a lot about the kamikazes as a whole, or Japan as a whole, or post-war Japan. It doesn't really do that. It gives you one slice of life, right? But it's a great example of that, and a book that's well worth reading. It's only about 225 pages or so, so not too large, but well worth your time. So if you're interested in these things, I would recommend Memoirs of a Kamikaze by Kazuo Odachi.